All right, welcome everyone. We are going to talk today about 10 steps to great cruising sales. We have Bob, Austin, and Peter, and they are going to be your hosts today. I will give it over to Austin, who will take you through everything. You are welcome to share your questions in the chat. We will open it up shortly to everyone in a few minutes. Take it away.
Thank you, Louisa. So welcome everyone to 10 Steps in Great Cruising Sales. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Austin Powers. I work out of the Annapolis, Maryland office, and I'm both a lifelong cruiser and racer. My family's a big cruising advocate and has taught me all the cruising ways. I'd like to welcome Bob. Bob, you want to tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. Been working in sales and on sailboats for about 20-something years now, and I'm currently having a very bad hair month.
And then Peter, why don't you tell everyone a little bit about yourself as well?
I'm the oldest guy in the group, but the most experienced. I've been sailing all my life. It's about 5 decades. I grew up, my family cruising. I've done a lot of racing, but I really, I've sailed so many different cruising boats and well over 100,000 miles. So I'm really familiar with cruising.
And what office are you guys out of?
Well, Bob is about 18 feet from me, and we are geographically located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Okay. And what would you say, Bob, what do you think your specialty is, if you have one, would you say?
For about 15 years ago, I noticed these little boats with 2 hulls coming on and spent a lot of time on cruising multi-hulls since then. But down here in South Florida, we're lucky to get everything from sunfish to super yachts.
Awesome. And what about you, Peter? Do you have anything you find yourself focusing in, or are you kind of a jack of all trades?
I think I have a wide range of experience because I do, cruising boats from 30 to 200 feet. And, but I'd like to say I really focus on cruising boats that are going to go anywhere from day sailing to sailing around the world of really any size.
Thank you. So to get started today, we're going to go through our 10 steps to great cruising sales, and then we'll take some questions at the end in the chat box if you guys have any. And the other thing we want to find out at the end of the chat is, if we were to do another one of these, what would you have it be on? What topic are you guys most curious about learning more about? And with that, I'm going to send it over to Bob to start with our step 1 of great cruising sales.
Hi, everybody. I like to make analogies. My brain works better that way. So the one thing I always explain to somebody is, coming in and saying you need new sails is kind of like telling a tire guy you need new tires. There are all sorts of tires for all sorts of purposes. You can see here that you can put snow tires on your Ford. You can race around on your Porsche. If you want to go mudding, you can go use some big knobby Jeep tires. Or if you're me and you got a little cute Kia, you just get something pretty simple. Knowing what you're going to do and knowing your experience is important, because usually what happens is someone calls up, they say they want sales. We say, well, what kind of sales? What are you planning on doing? And they say, oh, we're just cruising. Well, that doesn't help very much. Just cruising covers a wide range of activities. It can be a couple of your buddies going out in 30-footers and dancing around and having a good time for a while. Or it could be you and 1 or 2 others going off by yourself into the Southern Ocean, where your life pretty much depends on having good sails that work reliably every single time. So just cruising doesn't really narrow it down a whole lot. When you start discussing sales, the thing we like to zero in on is the clarity of the purpose. Why do you want the sales? We start with a conversation usually to know a little bit about your sailing experience. Now, it's not small talk. It helps a consultant get a frame of reference and a context to know where you come from. What kind of cruising have you done? Has it been the light duty stuff? Has it been heavy duty stuff? In many cases, I'm talking to somebody who's gone around the world twice. They probably know a little more than I do, and certainly about their boat. Have you done any racing? That informs the experience. It gives us an idea of expectations, of practices, of the way you like to proceed. Have you owned other boats? if everything's been a Catalina 22 and then a Catalina 27 and suddenly you're on, you know, an Oyster 48, that's a big jump. It helps us and to help you to know what are the differences. And then last, there's some people that are very, very detail oriented. They want to dive in and know absolutely everything and get their hands dirty. For others, sailing and cruising is pure recreation. They just want it to work. They don't really care how. And that comes out in a conversation about past experience as well. So knowing about past sailing experience of your own and helping a sail consultant know that is the first step in all this. Next, of course, that's looking back. We need to look forward. We need to know, what are your future sailing plans? What are the distances you're going to sail? If you're day sailing frequently, but just day sailing, that's one thing. If you're planning now for a trip throughout the Caribbean and up to San Diego, I'm in Fort Lauderdale, the next time you go sailing, those are longer distances. Some people are going across the Pacific. Latitudes that you're sailing in. Sails that are built for high UV conditions have some slightly different features than sails that are built that are going to go get icy, perhaps, and you'll be chipping ice off the sails. Knowing where you're going helps with that. Do you sail shorthanded, or do you sail with plenty of crew? Again, it's more of a, how are you going to use these sails, and then ultimately, do the places you're going, are there ways to get sails fixed? You know, 3, 4, 5, 6 years out, wear and tear catches up with you. We can plan for that, or not. If we don't know what's going on, we can't plan for it. So that's the next step, for knowing what your sailing goals are. The next, beyond that, is having an idea of how long you're going to own the boat. You probably have an idea about this. Is this your life's dream and you're going to hang on to it forever? Or you're going to have it for 2, 3, 4 years and then turn it. So if it's a long time, when you're looking at sales, you want to start thinking about total cost of ownership. Sure, there's the upfront cost, but also how long is this going to last? How long is this shape going to last? What are the ongoing maintenance costs going to be? You add all those up, and there's a cost per year there for owning that sail. That's a pretty important thing to think about. If you're just going to own it for a short time, well, you might do what some people do, which is, well, let's use the tire analogy again. If your lease is up in a month and you know these tires aren't going to pass muster, you're going to go put the cheapest things on there you can and just say, here you go, new tires. On the other hand, if you're the kind of person that has Garmin and Yanmar and Harkin and a thorough approach to high quality products on the boat, having something sticking out sideways as a cheaper product, well, it might not really be the best thing for the resale value. So in general, if you're only going to own the boat for a short time and then you're going to sell it, a lot of the brokers that we talk to talk about resale value, and that becomes a priority in your sailing goals as well. So those are the first 3 things: sailing experience, future sailing plans, and the length of ownership. But there's another part of the purpose of the sails that I think gets a lot of short shrift in cruising sails, and that's performance expectations. This is where that phrase, just cruising, comes back. People say, oh, I don't need racing sails, I'm just cruising. Well, the thing we try and explain, and unfortunately, so far we do it with math, which is not always the best way to do it, is what difference does half a knot and 5 degrees make to a cruiser? If you think about it, and you do the math, if you've got a Catalina 42 that's going to do 6 knots upwind and maybe it's got old sails, so you're sailing 50 degrees to the breeze. New sails that give you only just a half a knot and another 5 degrees, your cruising range, just upwind cruising range, just extended 17%. You can go farther. On the other way, if you know where you're going and you don't need to go farther, you can get there faster. You can get there almost 20% faster upwind with just a half a knot in just 5 degrees. Now, a lot of people say, well, I just enjoy the sailing. Absolutely right. You can keep sailing. It's a whole lot easier to go slower. It's not always easier to go faster. Better sails give you the opportunity to enjoy your boat more, to get to the mooring field sooner, to get to the bar sooner. It means you're not going to be frustrated with your kids if they make you leave the dock an hour later. Performance matters in cruising. the factor that gives you performance in cruising sails is sail shaping. And Austin's going to talk about that next.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think that's a really good point, and I think we all love that old cliche of if there are two boats on the water, they're probably racing each other. And I know when my dad is out there, even though he might be sailing around with one arm on the seat and drink in his hand, he's still racing the other boats out there. So I think it definitely does matter, especially for those cruisers who have come over from racing and still care about that performance aspect. So in talking about sail shape is just as important for cruisers as it is for racers. I think once we figure out that purpose that Bob was talking about, we can then start to narrow in on what sort of sail shapes and sail dimensions we might be looking for in the next cruising sail. I think a good example is maybe cruising head sails, where if you think you're someone who's going to be maybe motoring around in less than 10 knots, and then 10 knots is when you've decided you're going to start sailing, we might use a head sail with a smaller LP than, say, someone who's going to be trying to sail all the time. And even in the lighter air, we might give them a sail with a bigger area to work in the lighter air. Cruising sails require a different sail shape than racing sails. Typically, the clews are a bit higher because you're doing more off-the-wind sailing and reaching. They're a bit rounder in the back end to give the boat a little bit more power, because cruising boats do tend to be on the heavier side. And I think it's especially important for your sailmaker to figure out what sort of furling systems or sail handling systems you might have with the boat. Because if you have a furling Genoa, or you have a boom furling mainsail, or even a Dutchman system, the sail designer is going to design that sail a little bit differently to make sure it's mirroring in with the sail system you're looking for. One thing that happens to sail shape over time is sail stretch. We're always fighting that determining factor as sailmakers, is fighting stretch, which inevitably does happen no matter what material you use. Some materials do stretch more than others. As cruising sails age, we say the draft, which is the deepest point along the core length of the sail, moves aft. And one of the ways, or a couple of the ways we can tell this is happening, is one, you might notice with your sails that one, I can't point as high as I used to. Two, man, I'm really having to reef early. It's only 12 knots and the boat's over on its ear. And then three, you just start to heel over a ton instead of getting that forward drive that you might used to get out of when your sails were new out of the box. So once we get that good sail shape and we figure out what you guys should have as a sail shape, we need to then determine what material we want to make the sail out of. So I kind of broke this down into three categories. I broke it down into Dacron laminates, or cruising laminates, and then what we have at North with our 3DI technology. Polyester, or Dacron. DuPont coined the term Dacron, I think. What did you say, Peter, the term was? How long ago was it?
73 years ago.
73 years ago, and we still use it today. It's just a woven polyester fiber woven over a loom. They weave it in a XY fashion, and then they finish it with resin. It's important to note that not all Dacron is created equal. Less expensive Dacrons tend to derive their strength from the finish or the resin that's infused at the end of the process, while more premium Dacrons use bigger yarns and their strength is derived more from the overall weave itself. And why that's important is the more your sails flog and age, the resin does break down out of the cloth. So you want that fiber to take over once that happens, as opposed to it just stretching and having that draft move aft, which is what we talked about earlier on. The great thing about Dacron is we can get a really, really long-lasting sail structurally, and it's very, very cost-effective. Woven polyester is one of the less expensive fibers on the market, so we're able to produce a really nice cost-effective sail. When I talk about sail life, I mentioned earlier structure. So I think I look at it as two lives. A sail has a structural life, which is how long it's physically going to hold together, along with an aerodynamic life. And that's when the shape starts to move aft and it starts to get deeper, and we run into all of those heeling and reefing issues that I talked about a bit previous. And I think when you determine a sail is quote unquote blown out, it's different to different users. So a guy who used to race might feel like his sail's blown out pretty early on, where some cruisers might say, yeah, the sail does look a bit baggy, but I can get, 2 more seasons out of it. We hear that all the time. So it's different from person to person. I think you want to figure out where you do fall on that spectrum and when you feel like you're starting to lose a good bit of performance out of your sails. Moving on to cruising laminates. We utilize various fibers like polyester, aramid, and spectra, and even carbon in their construction to combat stretch. We then sandwich those fibers underneath layers of mylar and then infuse that with an adhesive to lock it all in. Generally, they come in a tri-radial construction, and as boats get bigger, these sails come into their own because they handle the loads that the big, heavy boats might throw at them. In terms of the structural versus aerodynamic life, they structurally hold together, maybe not quite as long as your Dacrons, but still a pretty long time. But in terms of the aerodynamic shape, you're going to see a bigger gain in terms of the overall aerodynamic shape of the sail over its lifetime. In terms of the cost, which is kind of that third component that we're always sprinkling in, it's going to be a little bit more expensive than Dacron depending on what fibers are used in the cruising laminate. And moving on to our 3DI process, which is what I think is maybe a bit of a misconception here at North, that it's only a racing product. But we actually use 3DI in a lot of the cruising applications as well. And it's trickled down from, yes, our racing technology, but it's just as applicable to cruising. You guys all might have heard of our older 3DL technology, which is where we would take those continuous yarns, lay it over a mold, and sandwich in between the mylar, very similar to that cruising laminate process we talked about. 3DI wanted to take that process, use it, but get rid of the parts that they thought might not work as well, which one was the mylar, because you can run into lamination issues, and two, they wanted to find a more efficient use of the fiber. So what they do is they take that fiber that comes off the roll and they turn it into these filament tapes. And what you'll see here is these filament tapes are pretty wide, and by using these filament tapes, one, they detangle any of the physical filaments in the yarn to make it straighter, so they get rid of some initial stretch like that. And then two, by spreading it, you get overall coverage and it disperses the loads when the sail gets hit with the wind better. Once those tapes are laid down, they can lay them down into thicker in the corners. They can make the body of the sail thinner without having to artificially build up the edges. They can make stanchion patches, batten pockets, all internal to the sail. And then that sail gets laid over the mold, shaped entirely by the mold, and then infused with resin to make a true composite sail. That construction comes in 3 different versions. 3DI Nordac, which is going to be the most cost-effective 3DI option, and then we get into the things like 3DI Endurance, which is Spectra Aramid or Spectra Carbon blends, and then 3DI Ocean, which is our bigger boat or super yacht application, but can get down all the way to 50-foot boats. I think in conclusion about 3DI, sorry about that. In conclusion about 3DI, you're looking at, on that 3-prong approach, you're going to get a really long-lasting structural sail, and you're also going to get an aerodynamic shape that's going to closely mirror that structural life, but it's going to come at a cost, which I think brings back Bob's analogy of the cost to own. You know, where do you feel like you fall on that cost to own the sail over a long time, or are you putting those tires on to get to your next least option if you're going to sell the boat quickly? Moving on from sailcloth, we want to get into sail components and finishing. I think Bob has a really good analogy for you guys.
Here's another one. That's how I think, analogies. We're down here in South Florida after Hurricane Andrew rolled through. Everybody lost their roof. Not everybody, but enough to make building codes focus on a very small little piece, little tiny metal attachments that actually hold the roof to the house so it doesn't blow away and it can stay there and do its job. Turns out little details, little components, and the way they're all put together actually matter structurally in a house as well as in the sail. So while the sail cloth holds sail shape, unless that thing holds together, doesn't rip, and stays attached, it's not much good. When you're looking for cruising sails, take the deeper dive and get into what are the individual components on the sail. Structurally, it can matter. How they get put together also matters, the level of detail. Another little analogy, in my house, there is a little tiny thing on the ground where 2 baseboards meet, and they're off by that much. And it's not enough for me to do anything about it. It's right there, and I'd probably mess it up anyway. But every time I walk by and look down, I notice there's this one little thing that's just not right. I hate that. If you're like that too, and you're afraid of finding something like that in one of your sails, get pictures of someone's previous work. Look for examples, not even on the big scale, but look at the micro level. When you're picking a cruising sail, know yourself, know what matters to you, and dive in on those things like that. Some examples of components that need to get looked at. The most common one, obviously, is battens. Most people think, well, battens is how many? And are they full or are they partial? Great questions, important. But batten material itself can play a big difference in the performance and the longevity of the sail. Most of the time, you might get a sail, it might just have flat, round, untapered, plain fiberglass battens. A batten's job is to support the roach. Those can do it just fine. However, it can also mess up sail shape a little bit. Battens that aren't tapered, they move the draft aft. Battens that are tapered support the leach better and respect the sail shape a little more. So know what kind of battens you're getting. That's one. Next, headboards. Make sure you're getting headboards that are consistent with whatever track system, if you've got one that's on the mast. You don't want a mismatch. It can easily fit, but a generic headboard just getting plugged into someone's system isn't going to last as well, might not hold the webbing as well, might have a strange setback if it's measured improperly. Headboards and corner hardware are important too. Next, reef hardware. The most common types of reef hardware are just some stainless steel press rings knocked into the tack reef and knocked into the clue reef. Might work fine for you. There's lots of options. More and more sailmakers, including us, have been moving toward the low friction rings. Anyone who's been sailing long distances offshore knows from time to time you adjust your clue reef lines, the ones taking the load, so they don't end up chafing in the same spot over and over. This is less of an issue with friction rings, which are nicer to your lines, and when you're pulling them in the last, I don't know, 20 inches under load, a little smoother. Again, just another small little detail that you should keep in mind. Next, clue blocks. Obviously, there's a wide range of hardware of any kind. Clue blocks, no change there either. Rutgerson, Harkin, Antal all make good clue blocks. If you've got an in-mast furling main or for some of the jibs that use them, know what kind of clue block you're getting. Out of the bag, it's not really going to matter. 3, 4, 5 years from now, it is. Also find out, how are they getting attached? If you look at the webbing like this, there's a lot of places, they'll take the webbing that holds the clue block, sew it to the outside of the cover, and the whole thing, the stitching cooks in 2 or 3 years, or the webbing cooks in 4 or 5 years. You go to pull the sail out one day and the clue block rips off. That's no fun. It's hard to make the boat go if you don't have a mainsail. So get an idea of how these things are put on, not just on the main, but take a look at the Genoa. Clue rings and Genoas as well. Same thing. And here in Florida, clue blocks and clue rings on Genoas, they sit exposed in the sun all the time. They're just sitting there slowly dying from the UV. Figure out what your priorities are. If UV is a thing, if it's going to flap a lot, know how your sail will be going together. Again, ask for pictures. When you're talking to somebody, ask for examples. These are some of the examples like that. There are a lot more of little features we won't go into now, but it really does have to do with the details that go into your sail. And that really comes from the next step in the process, which is to get a good cruising sail, it depends on how it's measured as well. There's no one better at measuring a sail than a guy that's been doing it for 30 years on all kinds of boats. So tell us what you do, Pete.
Thanks, Bob. I've always said the devil is in the details. And for example, there's no two boats that are alike, even production boats. I'll go to a Catalina 42 and the tack shackle is different on hull 181 than it is on hull 83. I like to combine my measurement process with photo documentation. And one thing I find it always amazes me is I'll see a new sail and it's really quite average looking. And we don't go for average, we go for perfect. And a client might actually not notice the difference between average and perfect. So let me go through a little more of the process that we go through to get perfection. So with the measurement, you're going to measure the 3 sides of the sail, the optimum spots, but the corners and the reef setbacks, all the little details, that go into the perfect fitting sail have to be exact. And one of the things that's forgotten a lot are spreaders, stanchions, pulpits, cotter rings that are hanging out at the top of a turnbuckle for the lifeline. Another classic example of mismeasurement is not getting the boom height right with the bimini top. I've measured boats where the Genoa tracks were too short to fit a 135. And so we had to have a discussion about, are we adding more track? Are we going to decrease the LP in the sail? A lot of things like that. There's a lot of, many manufacturers are furling systems, and your sailmaker should have an excellent knowledge of, there's probably 15, 20 different furling manufacturers. And it's really important to know, how they work, where the feeder section is. It's pretty common. I'll see a torn luff tape right where it enters and exits the luff foil. And that's because of a couple of reasons, but again, it's the detailed homework that goes into it. So let's see, moving proper measurement. These are great photos of what we do here. So the photo on the left shows where the tack shackle is, shows where the reef line is, and it shows everything in relationship. Everything's measured from the back face of the mast. That's zero, if you will. So when a designer's working on designing your sail, he knows where everything's measured from. The picture on the right is a custom-made boom with a Harkin outhaul car. The track is very short, so you have to note that the travel, and it also the way the shackles are set up. So on that sail, for that boat, I spec'd out an external stainless steel O-ring as opposed to a pressed-in ring or a webbing. So let's see. Okay, so roller furling. I love the picture on the left. The guy had gotten a code 0, and it's about 2 feet short of the maximum hoist available. One problem with that is the furler won't work properly, and consequently, sail could roll up improperly and actually backwind and jam. The other thing which would tick me off, because I like, certainly getting from point A to point B quickly, is sail area. You'd lose sail area, the sail wouldn't trim right. It's just an example of, getting an average sail. Now, if you look at the Genoa swivel below it, that's really nicely done. It's perfect spot for the swivel, good spot with in relation to the shiv box. I really like that. That's a great example of what a well done. Now on the spar on the right, that's a custom made mast. I wanted to make sure I knew the relationship to the swivel, to the shiv box, because the angle going in there is actually pretty tight. There's not a lot of space. I also wanted to know how we're going to place the code 0 head swivel in relation to the Genoa head swivel. So that's really, really important to the fit. So let's see, offsets. You hear the term offset. Well, offset is, for example, when you throw in a reef, the point at which the loaded area of the reef is actually behind the front of the sail. So you want to make sure that the reef ring takes all the load and not the slide above it. And the picture on the left, that sail was about a month old, and it was brought in here, and it was such a great example of the tack reef offset was too close, tore the sail. And then you can see the picture on the right. It not only tore the webbing up, if you look at the Harkin slide there, it's galled very badly where it went up against the track. So, those are all things that really, they're just not right. And they need to be right. Everything needs to be right.
Yeah, I think Bob had a good example that he was talking about earlier where, with the tires, again, if you have brand new tires, but they're misaligned, they're going to still wear out quickly. You know, it's got to be the proper fit and function.
Yeah. So just with regards to the measurement process and the boat setup process, I really like the client to participate, and I'll tell you why. One, we're both looking at the same thing. It prompts conversations and questions, great questions, and a classic is I'm going to ask the client, well, how do you use this? And then I might find out, oh yeah, it's a great idea. I didn't think of it that way. At any rate, in the boat setup and installation, having a properly tuned mast is really important. So when I'm measuring the boat, I'm looking at the mast bend fore and aft. I'm looking at the mast bend side to side. I'll check the head stay tension. It is very common that the head stay is loose, and it's very easy to tighten up a head stay. If you tighten up your back stay, turnbuckle 1.5 inches, you're going to really increase your head stay tension. Consequently, your sail will fly better, and you'll just get a longer lasting sail. I think it's really important to have the right tools to install your sails. The hammer, the vice grips, and the duct tape really aren't part of the program there. So I like to have my metric Allen keys, you know, all the right tools. And I usually have a discussion with the client. Do you have these tools available aboard? You know, so I know what level of detail they may play at, and maybe a couple of things I might suggest that they keep in their sailmaker tool bag, you know, to have the specific Allen key or a little wrench to take something apart. When I'm measuring a boat, I'm always looking to make sure that the Genoa cars move aft and forward well. And it's very common. The Genoa car goes to aft 2 holes and then it's stuck. And it either needs to have a penetrant on it with a lubricant followed up, or maybe the track is galled a little bit, just needs a little file to help it out. The winches could be dry and not have been serviced for a long time. You can definitely do this on YouTube, or you can call a rigger. Very important your wrenches work. Your roller furlers are very important to the overall process. I've gone to boats before where the roller furler was so hard to turn, and there was many reasons why it didn't turn. The bearings weren't lubricated, the furling line was bunched up in the drum, and the friction of the furling line going from the drum all the way aft to the cockpit was, you know, 50% more, where I could sit right behind the furler and pull it no problem. By the time I went aft to the cockpit and tried to pull the furling line, it just didn't want to turn. Same thing with the halyards. You want to move the halyard up and down. Make sure your shivs are working properly. Make sure there's no chafe. Make sure that the splices look good. Your Genoa sheets. Sometimes you'll see, you know, maybe a little scuff on the jacket of the Genoa sheet, no problem. But you might see a real chafe through to the core. That's a problem. And again, I just got to circle back. When we're doing this together, you're going to learn so much more. If possible, you can be there than you would if I just went to the boat myself. And I always invite my clients through the entire process.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Peter. So you would say this happens kind of simultaneously with the boat measurement. You're making these recommendations so that when you do order the sail and the sail comes in, then when you do the next part of this process, you're all ready to go.
Absolutely, 100%. That's all part of that upfront process. I want to make one other point. I really like dry Teflon lubricants. There's a product called McLube and also Super Lube. So having cans of those on board, go in your sailmaker's kit with the key tools.
Okay, so what would the next step of that process be, Peter? You've ordered the sail.
Okay, so now we're going to go to install the sail. And ideally, we're going to do it on a calm day so we can hoist the sails up, look at them, make some adjustments. I like to, backing up, when I install the sail, I want a clean deck. That may result in we have to take the sails down and move them aft or off the boat. But I really want to make sure the foredeck, if we're working on the Genoa, is really clean. Dock lines are, not crossing the deck. Really, it's easier to work on a clean surface. And then I want to make sure that if we're, for example, we're installing the mainsail track gate can come open, making sure that the outhaul is free, the reef lines are free. I like to pull them all the way out and make sure everything's really free running. So when we go to install the sail, we can slide, get the sail on easily and hoist it easily. I'll give you an example of, let's say we're installing a Genoa. So we're gonna stack the luff up right behind the furling system and make sure it's below the foil, and we'll put it in the port or the starboard groove. This is a question I got asked about a month ago. Which groove should I go in? My default personally is always port. There is no right or wrong one for a centerline halyard boat. Some people, if they have two Genoa halyards, they might put the port halyard, port groove. But I have been made aware by a client that their one groove was galled or had some problems, so only use this groove. So those are kind of important. I want to make sure the snap shackles are ready to go, or the shackles. I like to have some tape or some seizing wire, so when the shackles are installed, they can't come undone. So we're gonna hoist the Genoa up, and I'm gonna get you to tension it to a starting point. Then the next thing I might do is move the Genoa lead aft to a position where I think is a good starting point. And I'm gonna, really look around the boat, make sure the chafe patches are in the right spot, or if there's something else I could do right there on site to, really get that last detail right. And so that would be maybe how I would do the Genoa. So here we go. We're looking at an installation photo on the left's out sailing, and looking at the sag in between the two sails, looking at, if you look down at the furling drum on the staysail, you can see that the offset is excellent. It's not pulling at the pre-feeder right where her hand is. If you look on the picture on the right, that was a great example where we wanted to sheet a staysail to a certain point and we didn't want to add a track. And I do not like drilling holes into decks. So here's what we did with a piece of Spectra and a friction ring that Bob referred to in reef, and that's our staysail lead. It's lightweight, it works perfectly, and no holes drilled, and it can be removed anytime from the deck. So I think there's a lot of things that go into this, but it's a process. And if I could leave you with one thing, if you're participating in it, you're really going to get a better result.
And that really does lead well into the next issue. One of the steps involved in getting a good cruising sail is knowing a lot of what we're talking about here. You can have the best electronics on your boat. You can have a fantastic GPS. If you don't know what the buttons do or how to operate it, it's not going to do much for you. Same thing with a sail. If you don't know how it sets up, if you don't know that you're trimming it properly, it's not going to be as useful. You're not going to get your money's worth. It's going to hurt your enjoyment of your boat if you haven't learned. Fortunately, cruisers have a culture of continual learning and improvement. You can learn from us. You can learn online. You can take a course. John Kretschmer's got a great course. Pam Wall does stuff at boat shows. There's owners groups. There's an endless supply of fantastic sources of information about cruising. Keep learning. You will get a better product. You'll push the people you're working with to deliver a better product.
Absolutely.
It's an important step. That's what I wanted to cover here, because we don't deliver something. Well, we do, obviously, but we'd much rather work together with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the smile we see on people's faces when they see their boat, you know, go upwind for the first time in 20 years, or reach along in light air under a code zero is worth it. And when they know how to use it properly, it's an even better experience. And I think developing, you know, that rapport with your sailmaker is just as important. And I think that's what you're going to talk about here in a second, Peter.
Yeah,
Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about your relationship with David Walters for a second before we play kind of the video?
So in Fort Lauderdale, one of the storied brokerage firms is David Walters Yachts, and they really just sell cruising boats in the type of range we're talking about here. And I have a great relationship with them. They're brokers. I participate in sea trials many times. But what it does lead to is then I'll meet prospective buyers who maybe already have a boat, and we can get to know each other. It's really important you have a relationship with your sailmaker.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I saw this video on Facebook a few months ago, and I just couldn't believe, you know, how well done it was. And I thought it was a really good example of you kind of hitting on all those points that both Bob and you just talked about working, you know, with the customer on the boat, setting the sails up. And I'll just go ahead and play a little snippet of it here.
I'm a really hands-on guy. I really want to understand what the client needs, what the broker needs to help the client. And I'm involved in the process, which is quite unique, because I'll talk to the client for a couple minutes. I'll go sailing on the boat before they maybe even purchased it. A lot of value added there to really make it easier for all involved. So the other thing I would encourage you to do is, you know, have a relationship with your sailmaker. How do you go about it? Call your local guy up, or call another, you know, regional guy and interview them over the phone. See what they're all about. Ask them if they'll come to your boat and meet you on your boat. I'm a big fan of that. Again, conversations, questions come up. It's a little easier thing to do. Plus, everybody wants to leave work any day of the week and go talk about their boat. Yeah. And I get up early, so I'll meet you guys that are my age at 7 a.m. if you want to do that as well. And I think that you do not have to buy a sail. It's a common misconception to have a relationship with sailmaker. I've got relationships with people where they were 3 years out before they either purchased their boat or were ready to buy sails because they already had new ones. And we really knew each other well personally and understood each other. I'd gone sailing on their boat prior to building the sails. And boy, you learn a lot when you go sailing on a boat you've never sailed before, about what might be the best recommendation for the client. And at the end of the day, if we understand your needs, we'll be able to deliver you a great product and have a long-standing relationship.
Yeah, I think you told me about a cool story you had the other day, something about kind of like a tele sail check. You want to tell that story?
Yeah, so it's great. So with the Corona, we had a Corona virtual COVID-19 sail check. So it was virtual. It was over WhatsApp. The client's in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm in Fort Lauderdale. He went out sailing with his brand new North Sails, and he'd be walking around the boat. We were adjusting the halyards, adjusting the leads, outhaul tension, mast bend. We really worked on a lot of things, and we spent 45 minutes doing it. We were on both tacks, hard on the wind, reaching, really trying to establish, you know, what's really going on. And we got a great result. We had the boat going a knot faster at the end of it, mostly because the sails they weren't trimmed properly, and they didn't know how to trim them properly.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool story of how we can adapt to everything that's going on, and also, you know, just because you're not necessarily near the closest north loft, that doesn't mean we can't, call on the phone, email, Skype, whatever you need to do to make sure you have the best customer experience possible. And I think the final step of this process, which, relates back to that car example that Bob brought up again, is that yearly sale care. Just like your car, a sale needs to be brought in. We like to recommend once a year, or if you're someone who's going north and then south, doing that kind of go north in the summer, south in the winter, maybe in between each trip, bring your sales in for a quick checkup. Because if there's just a small little rip, we can address it very easily. It takes about 10 minutes, but if you don't address that rip, it can turn into a big rip later on. We can do things like wash your sails to take the dirt off of it. We can restitch any stitching that might be coming undone. All of these things that we can work on that take, 5-10 minutes in the shop can prevent big issues down the road when you're in a country where maybe it's not easy to get your sales service. So I think that's the final step of our 10 steps. I want to thank everyone for listening today. Louisa, do you think you could open up the chat real quick to hear any questions and maybe answer what people want to hear about going forward? So that's our 10 steps. I think if you walk yourself through all of those, you'll find yourself having a really great cruising sale experience.
Yep, the chat is open, so if you do have any questions, feel free to drop your questions there, and Bob, Austin, or Peter can answer them for you. So let's see what we've got going here. You guys just did such a good job that no one has questions so far.
We should reiterate the call. If there's something you'd like to hear more of, something you didn't hear that you'd like to hear, we will continue to look for ways to do webinars on topics that people care about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'll go ahead while we're waiting. I'll skip to the final slide. If you guys have any questions you want to ask, maybe not publicly or privately to any of us, there's our contact information as well. I know we're all working by email right now, and we'll easily answer any questions that you might have.
Yep. So, okay, here we go. We have Alan asking, could you address the difference between the NPL Tour and NPL Tour Ultra on a 43-foot boat?
So very specific, the NPL Tour versus the Ultra is going to have a different finish on the outside, I believe, right? Bob, you're big into the cruising laminates, and I think
it's got a thicker taffeta, but the biggest difference is just more of the fiber, really. Sorry, Ultra's got more Dyneema. The Tour's just more. Sorry, Tour's the Dyneema, and the Ultra starts to have carbon.
Yeah, I could maybe further define it. The Tour itself has some aramid and some Dyneema. The Ultra is more Dyneema because it's so robust of a fiber, and it also has Spectra taffetas on the outside for chafe. It's a really fantastic product for someone who wants a really grunty sail that's going to be very resistant to chafe and UV damage.
Yeah, I like that word grunty. It's like a cockroach. It won't die, right? It's just.
All right, Russ is asking if it is okay to keep your sails rigged over winter.
Absolutely. Here in Fort Lauderdale, it happens all the time.
All righty. Robert is asking if you can discuss.
Sorry.
Yep, sorry, go ahead, Bob.
I think it's possible that Russ doesn't live in 26, 27 degrees latitude. Anyone who's up in a colder climate, I think Austin would be a little better to answer that one, given that he's in Annapolis.
So the question was to leave your sail rigged over the winter. Was that it?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's fine as long as you do a couple things. I think you really want to make sure you secure if it's like a roll or furling sail, you want to make sure it's properly secured. Even in Annapolis, we tend to get storms and hurricanes going into the off season and winter blows. And I can't tell you how many times I've come down to the docks and seen someone's sail unfurl at the dock over the winter, and then it's shredded, and then hopefully he's calling me for a new sail, but it's something we never want to have to do. So I think if you do that, it's not horrible for the sail. It is going to be more windage, and that's why I think you want to at least make sure it's properly secured for any big winter storms you may have. But if you had the time, I really do think you should take your sails down either store them in a nice dry place or take them into the sail off, where we can easily store them in the proper conditions to keep them from getting damaged over the winter.
I'd like to address storing sails below in Florida. Some boats can get up to 140 degrees inside an ambient temperature, regardless of what type of sail you have down there. If you can avoid that, that would be great. If you have a laminate, you really not need to not store it below in a very hot boat.
Yeah.
All right, and just a quick reminder, this will be posted on our YouTube page by tomorrow, so you can get a copy of the entire presentation. Robert is asking if you can discuss the value and use of a code 0 for cruisers, and if there's any special rigging required.
Yeah, I actually did a presentation on that a week ago, and I think it's very boat dependent. The newer cruising boats, say boats that have come out in the last like 8 to 10 years, generally have non-overlapping rigs, which I mean their headsail doesn't go past the shroud base, which is great because the jib is very easy to tack. The sail handling becomes very easily. However, when you do crack off the wind, you are lacking a bit of, what was that word Peter used, grunt, to get the boat going in the lighter air.
A little giddy up.
That's where the cruising code zeros really come into their own. I think Bob can make a good point, especially about code zeros on multi-hulls, right? I think they're gaining popularity as well.
The trend you mentioned has really been seen in multi-hulls. It's been sliding the mast aft in the boat a little bit and putting a self-tacking track just in front of the mast to make it a little easier to sail the boat. You don't have as much jib sheet to pull when you're tacking. That's making smaller mains, which overall is starting to depower the boats a little bit more. The solution to that is some sort of code 0 sail. Code 0 has become a general term that applies to something that lives between a Genoa and an asymmetrical spinnaker. There are many differences, and they all have to do with something that, well, I've certainly been familiar with in the last few years, which is how wide they are in the middle. A true code 0 is very wide in the middle, not quite like a spinnaker, but on its way. A cruising code 0 gets skinnier and skinnier and skinnier. The skinniest might be like a catamaran screecher is another generic term that gets thrown out there. But it all has to do with a relationship of how wide is the middle compared to the foot. Are they useful? Absolutely. The key is making them easy to use and making them out of the right fabric for the intended use. Something that is fragile, you need to take it down all the time, which isn't as convenient, but it might be more powerful. Something that's rugged, especially on a cat, you can build it to leave up and furled as much as possible and give a little power. The design changes have made cruising code 0s more important than ever.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here with a thing? I recently did a sea trial with a new code 0, and it was ironically on a 25-year-old Little Harbor 54. And the guy always had complained about how slow he was, you know, on a reach with his 130. And we were sailing at about 60 apparent with his Genoa up going 5 knots. And when we rolled out to code 0, we were going almost 7.5. And this is 10 knots of wind. And the boat just absolutely lit up. And the client would have normally rolled up his jib and turned on his engine. And really incredible power to the sail, to the boat.
Yeah, they've gained in popularity, and I think with the advances in the design and the ability to add, you know, things like a light UV cover, they've become, you know, more useful because you can leave them up for extended periods of time and operate them as if they were, you know, your furling headsail. So I think he's on the right track, and they're absolutely useful sails.
All right, and Martin is asking the general difference between monohull and multi-hull sails.
In a nutshell, multi-hull sails have to be tougher. They have to be stronger. When a monohull gets a blast of wind, the boat depowers because it heels over, knocks the boat over a little bit, hopefully not too far to spill your beer, but enough to depower the rig a little. It's built into the nature of a monohull. Multi-hulls don't. You get a blast of wind, the sails load up, the standing rigging loads up, the running rigging loads up, everything loads up. If you put a low stretch halyard on, suddenly you've removed a shock absorber. Now it's the sails load up and the standing rigging loads up. If you put a low stretch sail on, now there's no absorption in that either. And you get a gust, and that wind is being turned into thrust without any deflection of the dealing with the righting moment of the boat. Multi-hull sails have to be tougher. They're usually in the material. The components, similarly, have to be bigger and stronger. And often, because the boats, at least until the last 5 or 6 years when the designs have taken off, you often want them as big and as powerful as possible. I knew a guy with a Lagoon 450 who said, give me the biggest asymmetrical spinnaker I can put on his boat. I think we made him happy.
All right, and now let's see, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Harry is asking the longevity on 3DI Nordic jibs, which he just installed on his Saga 43.
Nice.
Nice. That's a great boat. The sails have been around since I think 2015, and at least everyone that I've sold sails to has been extremely happy with them. And I think the longevity should mirror that of, and structurally, going back to that structural versus aerodynamic talk, structurally it should last just as long as your Dacron sail. But I think what you'll really find is that the shape is there much longer into the life than if you had purchased, say a cross-cut woven polyester sail. So I think you made an excellent choice, and enjoy your new 3DI sail.
All right, one last question we have time for. Philip is asking for Hansi self-tacking setup. Do you have a view on Genoa versus Lapper for performance cruising / beer can racing?
He said it was on a Hansa. What was the model?
It just says Hansa.
Hansa. And so, and he's got a non-overlapping jib currently, is what he's asking.
Self-tacking setup versus, let's see. They just want to know your view on Genoa versus Lapper, i.e. patent or high roach self-tacker for performance cruising / beer can racing.
I think we can answer that generally probably pretty quick, but for a more specific answer, we'd want to just take a couple looks at the Hansa, and Philip, get right back to you. So if you can, we'll probably have your email, and that's when we'll zoom in. The whole self-tacking jib approach, as I mentioned before on catamarans, has turned into just something that's making people's lives a lot easier. If you're talking cruising and beer can racing, the biggest thing is you don't have to bring as many crew, or the crew doesn't have to be as strong. If that's something that's smaller, they're not going to pull as much. Suddenly your friend's wife or yours or children are going to have a much easier time. Notice I'm not talking about performance. I'm talking about overall enjoyment of the experience. That's the response that I want to give right away on that, and we'll follow up with more later.
Yeah, I think that could be even another opportunity to have that Code Zero and the self-tacking jib working together, maybe, where you sail upwind with the self-tacker, and then if you get on a reach on your beer can race, you can roll it out pretty easily and maybe go a bit faster, but without having to put your beer down, maybe. So.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you Bob, Austin, and Peter. As I said earlier, this presentation will be on our YouTube page by tomorrow if you would like to rewatch.
And our emails are right there. If we didn't get to your question, please email one of us. Thank you.
He's like a life insurance salesman, excuse him.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll all be doing that soon, sailing off into the sunset.